When you work with a client, what are some of the common mistakes that you see, and perhaps what are some of the low hanging fruit that people miss that are really easy things to do that can be a really huge benefit to somebody's health and body composition?
So I think a low hanging fruit for somebody would be just as simple as add a source of protein that you enjoy to your breakfast every day and make that a habit and do it continuously day to day. And that could be a yogurt, that could be a cottage cheese, that can be eggs, egg whites. It could really be anything you want. As long as you're doing that on a consistent basis, that gets you in the habit of kind of centering your meal around your protein. And for someone who's, for example, in a calorie deficit, having protein at each meal is going to allow them to feel more satiated and therefore eat less calories and adhere to their program.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, protein is incredibly important, right? And like you were mentioning, most people underestimate their protein intake. Um, I know I do that even sometimes still, right? Where I'm like, man, did I really get 200 grams of protein today? And when I start to think about it, I'm like, probably not. But I usually think I probably hit that mark. And for those that are listening, the big importance with protein is that it really helps with satiety and hunger regulation. I think that's one really, really important component that people often don't think about because we think about protein, we're like, oh, building muscle. But aside from building muscle, it does really help you stay full and satiated. I was reading some really interesting research where I think they took overweight and obese women, gave them a standardized breakfast and lunch. After the lunch, they gave them a standardized snack. All of the snacks were isocaloric, meaning they had the same amount of calories. The difference was that one snack was a high protein snack. The other two snacks were high carb, high fat snacks, low protein. All of the snacks were 100 calories or like 120 calories or something like that. And those that consumed the high protein snack using what's it called, the visual analog scale, mentioned that they felt fuller after the snack. Why does that matter? Well, after that, they gave them an ad lib dinner. And in general, the women that consumed the high protein snack ate like 100 to 150 calories less at dinner, right? These are not women that are tracking their calories. This is simply behavioral stuff. If you have foods that help you feel a little bit fuller, you're likely to eat a little bit less. And protein is incredibly important for that. I agree with you. I think that is the number one low hanging fruit for most people. Most people do not follow a high protein diet. Perhaps it's because of the RDA. We could talk about that slightly. And perhaps it's because sometimes people just don't prefer high protein foods. I think there's a lot of stigma around high protein foods, meat in particular being quote unquote bad for you. And there's a lot of nuance there that we can get into as well. But simply just increasing your protein intake, right? The data do show that if you just eat a little bit more protein, you're likely to eat a little bit less in terms of total calories. Another nutrient I really want to talk about because I've always focused on, and most people just focus on protein, right? But what's the other nutrient that is extremely beneficial and satiating as well and has a ton of health benefits? Fiber, right? And I feel like fiber is like the ugly duckling. Like it's not that sexy because it doesn't help you build a ton of muscle or anything like that. But it's incredibly important, man. Do you want to touch on fiber a little bit? General recommendations, RDA, why it's important,
Yeah.
health, all that
Yeah.
stuff?
Absolutely. I think fiber, it actually is sexy when you get into it. Wasn't until I got into graduate school and I started getting into fiber and the
Yeah.
effects on the microbiome and short chain fatty acids and how those affect you and, decreased risk of, certain types of cancer, specifically colon cancer. So I really do think if you really get into fiber, I do think that it is just as sexy as protein is, if
Yeah.
not more.
Maybe
But
you and I do, but I would say that most people
yeah, right.
don't.
But from a recommendation standpoint, yeah, I always recommend the general recommendation for fiber intake is 25 grams per day for women and 35 grams per day for men, or you can say
Yeah,
14 grams,
14, yep.
right? It's 14 grams. I was like, this is 10 or 14? 14 grams for every 1,000 calories that you're eating. I would prefer to do it based on calories because it just makes sense. You're digesting more calories and you're eating equal parts of
Yep.
fiber. I think fiber is one that gets underlooked. And it's interesting because from a coaching standpoint, when you really look at it, yeah, there are some fruits and vegetables that are very high in fiber, but the best bang for your buck that you're going to get is from eating more whole grains. So a simple switching from white rice to brown rice, eating more quinoa, eating whole wheat pasta versus regular pasta. Now, obviously, there are going to be some taste preferences there, and you may
Yeah.
enjoy some things over others. But just as a general rule of thumb, consuming more whole grains, eating adequate fruits and vegetables, those are going to be tremendous for your satiety and tremendous for your results. And not to mention the micronutrient standpoint, you're eating, you're getting a lot more nutrient density when you're consuming some of these foods.
Yeah, and if I could add to that as well, legumes, beans, right? Like, those are my favorite sources because I'm not a big fan of, like, whole wheat stuff unless it's whole wheat bread. But, like, rice, I just always have white rice because personally, I just hate brown rice, man. I come from a Cuban background. We eat white rice and beans with pretty much every meal, but I do eat a good amount of beans. I love beans, lentils, black beans, chickpeas, whatever it is, and they're really high in fiber as well. Unfortunately, I feel like I don't know, beans are not as popular in the US as they are in other countries. Like my culture, we eat beans with every single meal. Part of that comes from poverty and it's a cheap food and it's just something that everybody has access to. It's good source of protein, good source of fiber. Um, but it's funny because like a lot of these very poor countries actually have pretty healthy like dietary patterns, right? Eating more pulses, eating more whole grains, things that are really, really cheap but do have a ton of health benefits. I'd love for you to highlight what are some of the health benefits of fiber. You mentioned satiety and hunger regulation, but aside from that,
Yeah. So, from a digestion standpoint, we know that soluble fiber, for example, things like inulin that's found in like garlic and wheat, will feed the quote unquote kind of good bacteria.
yeah,
And those bacteria will create short chain fatty acids
mhm,
that will yield energy. This is kind of where we get into like, well, net carbs, are they really a thing?
yeah.
Not really. But those short chain fatty,
You mind explaining that a little bit? Sorry, because I'm sure people just
the
heard that
net
and they're like,
carbs,
wait, what does that mean? Yeah,
yeah, yeah. So net carbs, the FDA allows net carbs to be on a label as you basically subtract the calories from fiber from the total calories that are on the label. So, for example, if you have a protein bar that's also high fiber, 15 grams of fiber, whatever those calories are going to be subtracted from the label. The issue with that is that the fiber actually does get broken down. It's just that we don't have, our bodies don't have the enzymes to break down the
yeah,
bonds between those chains. So what happens is our microbiome, they actually consume that, they ferment it, and then they create short chain fatty acids. So essentially they're creating fat, and then those fats can yield energy and calories. Now, most of that energy actually goes into your colonocytes or the cells inside of your colon to, you know, reproduce ATP, increase cell proliferation, things of that sort, which is also wildly beneficial. But the point with the net carbs is really more so that we don't know is the issue. We don't know how many calories are actually being extracted
yeah,
because, for example, some people have what's called a strain of bacteria called firmicutes, which will yield more calories from the foods that they're breaking down, and other people have less of that and they'll yield less calories. So, just to be safe, because you don't know what your microbiome is, and it's so different from person to person, I would just say those net carbs, if you're looking at your calories, just add them in there and that will help you to create, you know, it's always better to overestimate than it is to underestimate when it comes to weight loss at the very least.
yeah. I think what you mentioned in terms of like, we don't know exactly how many calories you're going to get here from this fiber. And it's going to be different from person to person depending on what your microbiome looks like. But the important thing to note is that you're not getting 0 calories, right? And that's the way net carbs are being reported, right? It's like, oh, 10 grams of fiber, just subtract 40 calories. You're not getting those at all. And that's not true, right? And now I don't want people that are listening to hyper focus on this because if you're eating high fiber foods, great. You're in a good place. Don't worry about the 40 calories. But if we're being as accurate as possible, you're definitely not getting 0 calories from consuming it. You might be getting anywhere between 2 or 3 calories per gram rather than four. It's certainly going to be less than a simple carbohydrate, but certainly it's not going to be zero. Now, for those of you listening that are perhaps perfectionists, don't worry about trying to figure out the exact amount. As long as you track the same way consistently, you're good, right? Because let's say you track net carbs the way they are reported, and now you're like, oh my God, I'm underreporting by, I don't know, 100 or 150 calories per day. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter as long as you do it consistently the same way. If you're not seeing the changes that you want to see, just reduce the caloric intake that you're consuming and continue to track the same way. What matters with tracking is consistency, because if there are errors in your tracking, which there's errors in everybody's tracking, those errors stay consistent over time if you track the same way and eat the same foods. So it may not be perfect, like the number may not be accurate, but at least you're precise with the way you're measuring. And that's probably the best way to move forward. Right. And so from a digestive standpoint, fiber is incredibly important. I think people also don't understand that one of the best things that you can do for improving blood lipids and lowering cholesterol is eating more fiber. Right. People like to hate on saturated fat, red meat, etc. But if you also just eat more fiber, you're probably going to be in a good place. And fiber consumption can help reduce LDL cholesterol, which is really important as well. Right. So, talking a little bit more science here too, it's like you have this stuff in your intestines that you secrete called bile, BILE, which helps with the emulsification and digestion of fat. Right. Now, there's a lot of cholesterol in bile, and bile is recycled, right? So when you produce feces, you actually recycle some of that bile and the bile can be reused. And again, as I just mentioned, bile is high in cholesterol. Well, when you consume fiber, you actually excrete a good amount of the bile in your feces, right? So essentially, you're getting rid of cholesterol by consuming more fiber, which is a really easy and simple way to help reduce your cholesterol levels if they are elevated. Right now, one thing I always like to mention is like, because people start to really hyper focus on these like hacks or whatnot. It's like, listen, if you're overweight or you're obese, if you're not physically active, those things are going to give you the biggest bang for your buck. Simply losing excess body fat, being more physically active will improve your blood lipids to a greater extent than reducing your saturated fat intake or increasing your fiber. But a combination of those variables is really powerful, right? Like if you start exercising, if you start losing a little bit of weight, you notice that, hey, my cholesterol's still a little bit high. Now I start eating a little bit more fiber. Now I start substituting saturated fats for perhaps unsaturated fat sources. You're going to get the biggest synergistic effect there, right? And then on top of that, I guess, dude, we could talk about fiber forever. If there's one nutrient that is associated with a reduced risk of pretty much everything, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, which is
Absolutely.
really interesting, and even all cause mortality, it is fiber, right? Now, one thing I'm not well aware of, Daron, and you may or may not be, and if you're not, that's fine. We could perhaps research it for another episode. But when it comes to the cross-sectional data showing like benefits of higher fiber consumption with a reduced risk of these diseases, is there a cutoff? Or is more fiber always better? And the reason I ask is because protein, people tend to think more protein is better. And it's like, no, like if you have sufficient protein, you're good. More protein isn't necessarily better. Is there a similar effect with fiber there?
I don't know, and I don't know how that would affect digestion either,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Obviously, that's gonna affect you if you have too much fiber, that can affect you. In some cases, it would actually be like fiber helps with your bowels, but in some cases, too much fiber may have the reverse effect.
Yeah.
So, but outside of that, from health outcomes, I don't know. There hasn't been any data where I've seen like a cap.
Yeah. Yeah. Same here. And I honestly just haven't looked into it too deeply, but I will say anecdotally, I've experienced what you mentioned working with clients where they have low fiber intake. We have a conversation about how important fiber is. And then the week after, they're like, man, I haven't gone to the bathroom. And they're reporting their fiber. And it's like 70, 80 grams per day. And I'm like, holy shit, dude, you just went from like 10 to 15 grams to like 70 or 80 grams. That's a huge shift, right? And they're like supplementing with fiber and all this stuff. And like, great. I love the effort, like A for effort, but execution probably wasn't the best. And I'd say for most people, it's probably best to titrate up, right? Like not go from 0 to 100 real quick, but like Drake says, to do it slowly because, yeah, you do. I mean, if you're not used to eating a high fiber diet, you do feel it, right? Bloating,
Yeah.
constipation. Because one of the things that I try to explain to people, it's like your biology, the way your body works, at least let's talk about from a metabolism and digestion standpoint, your body adapts to whatever your diet looks like, right? So, like the microbes in your microbiome, and even down to like the enzymes that your body is producing more of, is going to be specific to the type of diet that you follow. So, it may take some time for your body to adjust to a higher fiber intake and for your digestion to adjust to a higher fiber intake. This is one thing that people also experience when they're going on a higher protein diet, right? Perhaps somebody that doesn't eat much meat at all is now eating substantially more meat. so that they can get their protein intake. They're like, man, my digestion's a little bit off. It's like, just stick with it. It takes a little bit of time. It's probably why it's best to just titrate up slowly. What are your thoughts about that?
Titrating up with protein or just in general?
With fiber in particular.
Yeah, with fiber, I think it does take, especially when you look at it from a microbiome standpoint, it does
Yeah.
take time for your microbial composition or certain colonies to populate even further.
Yeah.
So you want to give your body time and I think the microbiome, obviously a huge topic, but it is something that's very important when it comes to digestion and how your digestive system functions. It's just interesting. People talk about, like serotonin and dopamine that are made in hormones that are made in the gut. And we often think about those things as, oh, well, that can affect the brain. But actually, what we find is that they never make it to the brain.
Mm.
They have a function in the gut, and that function is to do things like increase gut motility and so on and so forth. So when we think about, okay, well, there are certain types of bacteria that will increase motility, it takes time for them to populate as you make these dietary adjustments. And that could be said for any dietary adjustment. If you increase your protein, that's going to
Yeah.
affect your microbiome. If you increase your fiber, it's going to do the same thing. So, short answer is yes, you definitely do want to titrate up over a period of time and let your body adjust.